At 11 o'clock on the night of November 12, 1942, Rear Admiral Daniel Callaghan stood on the bridge of the heavy cruiser USS San Francisco and watched his radar screens show a Japanese formation crossing directly into his path. The formation included 2 battleships. Callaghan had 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers. He had no battle plan that covered this. He issued the order that his communications could support. Odd-numbered ships fire to starboard, even-numbered ships fire to port. At 1:48 in the morning of November 13th, a Japanese shell struck the bridge of the USS San Francisco. Callaghan was killed on the bridge of the San Francisco. The battle he had started by sailing into the Japanese formation continued for another 45 minutes without him. Henderson Field was not bombarded that night. Callaghan never knew that his attack had stopped the bombardment. 7,000 Japanese soldiers sent to retake Guadalcanal. 4 days, 2 navies, 2 American admirals dead in one battle in one night, 2 Japanese battleships at the bottom of Ironbottom Sound. Henderson Field never touched. The operation Japan designed to end the Guadalcanal campaign ended the campaign in the wrong direction. I spent 7 hours writing, editing, and researching this story to verify every ship name and every minute of timing exactly right, because the naval battle of Guadalcanal is the battle that was decided by a dead admiral's attack on the first night and a radar operator's aim on the second, and because the 7,000 Japanese soldiers who sailed from Rabaul and never reached Guadalcanal with their weapons deserve to be counted by name. If this story matters to you, like this video. Just like that. That is all. Thank you. Rear Admiral Daniel Callaghan and Rear Admiral Norman Scott are the only 2 admirals of the United States Navy killed in a surface engagement in the Second World War. Both died on the same night, in the same battle, operating less than 2 miles apart when they were killed. Both received the Medal of Honor posthumously for their actions in the battle. Neither man knew the other had been killed. Neither knew that the American fleet, battered and damaged, had survived the night and that Henderson Field was still standing. The USS Juno was torpedoed on the morning of November 13th, 1942, and sank in 20 seconds. Joseph Sullivan, Francis Sullivan, Albert Sullivan, Madison Sullivan, and George Sullivan were all aboard. All 5 were killed. George Sullivan survived the sinking of the Juno, but died in the open water 5 days after the ship went down. The 5 Sullivan brothers became the most famous American casualties of the naval battle of Guadalcanal, and among the most widely remembered American casualties of the entire Second World War. Their faces appeared on recruiting posters. The Navy named a destroyer after them. The United States Navy had a standing policy against multiple members of the same immediate family serving together aboard the same vessel. An exception had been made for the 5 Sullivan brothers at their specific request. They had refused to be separated. In response to their deaths, Congress passed legislation protecting the sole surviving son in a family from combat deployment. The plan Japan designed for November was sequential in its dependencies. Each step depended on the step before it. The 2 battleships, Hiei and Kirishima, loaded with special Type 3 fragmentation shells designed specifically for the destruction of parked aircraft, would bombard Henderson Field on the night of November 12th to 13th and destroy the American aircraft based there. With the American airfield destroyed and no air cover available, the 11 transport ships carrying 7,000 soldiers of the 38th Infantry Division would arrive the following day and unload their cargo safely. The soldiers would go ashore with their full complement of artillery, ammunition, vehicles, and all the material that an infantry division needed to conduct offensive operations against a defended perimeter. The 38th Division would arrive fully intact, operationally ready, and equipped to conduct the offensive that the soldiers already on Guadalcanal could not. The ground offensive against Henderson Field would follow immediately. The plan was sequential. The first step failed on the first night. The reason the plan failed in its first step is that Rear Admiral Callaghan sailed directly into the Japanese formation. He knew he was outnumbered and outgunned. He knew that the Japanese battleships had guns that would destroy his cruisers at any range where the cruisers could effectively fight back. He knew that the USS San Francisco was not a battleship and that nothing in his formation was a battleship. He also understood that if the Japanese formation reached Henderson Field and bombarded it without interference, the American aircraft based there would be destroyed. With them would go the one decisive American advantage remaining in the area. He sailed his cruisers and destroyers directly into the formation because there was no tactical alternative that left Henderson Field intact at dawn. Fleet Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commanding the combined fleet from Truk, had been trying to solve the Guadalcanal problem since August of 1942. The island had been in American hands since August 7th, when Marines landed on Guadalcanal and captured a nearly completed Japanese airfield that the Americans named Henderson Field after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway. Every Japanese naval and ground operation since August of 1942 had been, in one form or another, an attempt to retake that airfield. 3 months of those attempts had failed. 3 months of Japanese attempts to retake the island had failed. The fundamental tactical problem Yamamoto faced was supply. The Japanese soldiers already on Guadalcanal were dying from starvation and tropical disease because the Americans controlled the daylight air above the island and had made daytime supply runs effectively impossible. The partial tactical solution Yamamoto had found was the Tokyo Express. Destroyers running troops and supplies down the slot at night, fast enough to avoid American air attack from Henderson Field. Destroyers could carry men and small quantities of light supplies, but not the heavy equipment that mattered. They could not carry artillery pieces. They could not carry vehicles. They could not carry the heavy equipment that made an infantry division operationally capable of assaulting a fortified position like Henderson Field. To actually retake Henderson Field from the American Marines, who had been holding it since August, Japan needed to deliver an entire reinforced infantry division with all its combat equipment. To deliver that division with its artillery and vehicles, Japan needed slow, large transport ships rather than destroyers. Slow, large transport ships operating in the waters around Guadalcanal in November of 1942 would be found and destroyed by American aircraft from Henderson Field the moment daylight arrived. To protect the transports during their daylight approach to Guadalcanal, Henderson Field had to be completely destroyed the night before. To destroy Henderson Field required battleships with large-caliber naval guns, because the airfield's infrastructure and aircraft revetments were too hardened for cruiser-caliber fire, and the field was too far from Japanese air bases for sustained bombing to be effective. The logic of the Guadalcanal problem led Fleet Admiral Yamamoto directly and inevitably to the conclusion that Hiei and Kirishima had to be used. The plan was not improvised. It was the product of 3 months of operational analysis. The first night of the battle produced a kind of combat that had almost no precedent in modern naval warfare. Callaghan's formation of 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers sailed into the middle of Abe's force of 2 battleships, 1 light cruiser, and 14 destroyers in complete darkness. The ships were so intermingled within minutes that Japanese ships were firing on other Japanese ships and American ships were firing on other American ships. The USS Lafay passed so close to the Hiei that the Japanese gunners could not depress the main gun barrels enough to bring the American ship under fire. The USS Atlanta was struck first by Japanese fire, and then by American fire from the USS San Francisco, which had lost situational awareness in the close-range melee, and fired at a radar contact it could not identify as friend or enemy. Rear Admiral Norman Scott, commanding from the Atlanta, was killed. Callaghan was killed at 1:48 in the morning. His fleet continued fighting without its admiral. The Japanese formation was disrupted enough that Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe, commanding the bombardment force from the bridge of the Hiei, decided not to complete the bombardment of Henderson Field that night. The Hiei had been struck by hundreds of small-caliber shells from the American cruisers and destroyers during the melee. Abe turned the battered formation north, away from Henderson Field and away from the mission. Henderson Field was not bombarded. At dawn on November 13th, Henderson Field was still operational, its aircraft intact and its runways undamaged. The Hiei was limping northward, with extensive topside damage from the hundreds of shells that had struck her during the night. The aircraft from Henderson Field found it within hours of sunrise. The 13th of November was the day the Japanese paid for Abe's decision not to bombard. American aircraft from Henderson Field attacked the slowly moving and badly damaged Hiei in repeated strikes from morning through the afternoon. The Hiei, unable to maneuver effectively at reduced speed, absorbed attack after attack. By mid-afternoon, the Hiei was beyond saving. Her crew was transferred to accompanying destroyers, and she was scuttled in the afternoon. Japan had dispatched two of its most capable surface combatants, specifically and exclusively, to destroy Henderson Field. One of those two battleships now lay at the bottom of Ironbottom Sound. The airfield it had been sent to destroy was directing the very aircraft that had put it there. The 11 transports were still coming. Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka, known throughout the Japanese Navy as Tenacious Tanaka for his insistence on completing missions regardless of circumstances, had watched from a distance as the first night's naval battle unfolded. He had 7,000 soldiers of the 38th Division and all their equipment aboard 11 transport ships. He continued south on schedule, maintaining formation despite the naval losses of November 12th to 13th. On the morning of November 14th, 1942, the 11 Japanese transports were in open water north of Guadalcanal in full daylight, without any Japanese air cover of any kind. Henderson Field had known they were coming since the previous afternoon and had been preparing to receive them. The airstrikes on November 14th came in waves. Aircraft from Henderson Field, aircraft from the carrier Enterprise operating to the south of Guadalcanal, and Army B-17s based at Espiritu Santo all located the transport convoy in the open sea. 7 of the 11 Japanese transports were sunk during the day's series of American air attacks. The soldiers of the 38th Infantry Division aboard those ships drowned or were killed in the airstrikes. The men who went into the water north of Guadalcanal in November of 1942 were in shark-infested waters far from any friendly coast, with no immediate rescue coming. The 4 transports that survived the November 14th attacks continued south toward Guadalcanal. Tanaka had been ordered to deliver his troops regardless of losses. He delivered them. Yamamoto understood by the end of November 14th that the operation had effectively failed, even before the second night's naval action. The 4 transports that had survived the air attacks had lost 7 of their 11 original ships. The soldiers who had drowned when their transports were sunk had taken their artillery, vehicles, and heavy equipment to the bottom with them. What remained of the operation was salvage. Deliver whatever soldiers and supplies could still be put on Guadalcanal. Yamamoto sent Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo south on the night of November 14th to 15th with a second naval bombardment force, determined to complete what Abe had turned away from. Kondo's force consisted of the battleship Kirishima, 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 9 destroyers. He would finally execute the Henderson Field bombardment that Abe had abandoned on the first night. The USS Washington and her radar were waiting for him. Rear Admiral Willis Lee commanded Task Force 64 from his flagship, the USS Washington. He had the Washington and the USS South Dakota, 2 modern fast battleships, plus 4 destroyers to screen them. Lee understood that a Japanese bombardment force was approaching and positioned his battleships in the waters south of Savo Island to intercept it. Shortly after 10 o'clock on the night of November 14th, the second major surface engagement of the 4-day naval battle began south of Savo Island. The battle went badly for the Americans from the start. 3 of Lee's 4 destroyers were sunk or crippled in the opening minutes. The USS South Dakota then suffered a catastrophic electrical failure, lost power to her radar and fire control systems at the worst possible moment, and was struck repeatedly by Japanese shells while unable to return effective fire. She was burning and out of the fight. Rear Admiral Willis Lee was left with only the Washington operating effectively, 1 battleship against the Kirishima and the remaining Japanese force. The USS Washington carried the Mark 8 fire control radar, one of the most capable naval fire control systems in the Pacific Fleet at that point in the war. At just after midnight on November 15th, the Mark 8 radar locked onto the Kirishima at 8,400 yards in total darkness. Aimed fire at that range without radar would have been impossible. Lee ordered the Washington to open fire at 12:17 in the morning of November 15th, 1942. In the 7 minutes that followed, The Washington fired 75 16-inch armor-piercing shells and over 40 rounds of 5-inch secondary battery fire at the target the radar had located in the darkness. 9 of the 16-inch armor-piercing shells struck the Kirishima. The Kirishima took fires below decks that spread faster than her damage control teams could contain them, lost her steering entirely, and went dead in the water within the hour. Her surviving crew was transferred to escorting destroyers under continued American fire, and she was scuttled in the early morning hours of November 15, 1942. Henderson Field was not bombarded on the second night of the battle either. The USS Washington had removed from the battle the only ship in Kondo's formation with the gun caliber to have bombarded Henderson Field effectively. Rear Admiral Tanaka, carrying out his orders to the last, beached the 4 surviving transports at Cape Esperance on the northwestern coast of Guadalcanal at 4 in the morning on November 15, 1942. The ships were too slow and too damaged for a conventional offshore unloading operation. Running them aground was the only way to get the soldiers onto the island at all. Within hours of the first transport grounding at Cape Esperance, American artillery from Henderson Field and aircraft from both Henderson and from the Enterprise were attacking the 4 beached ships. Soldiers of the 38th Infantry Division, who had survived the voyage from Rabaul, the November 14th air attacks on their transports, and the second night's naval battle, were jumping from burning ships into the surf and running for the jungle line under artillery fire. What Raizo Tanaka delivered to Guadalcanal from the entire convoy of 7,000 soldiers, 11 transports, and 4 days of naval fighting was approximately 2,000 men, 260 cases of ammunition, and 1,500 bags of rice. The division's artillery pieces were on the floor of the slot, the vehicles were on the bottom, the ammunition in quantities sufficient to sustain any offensive operation was on the floor of those same waters. The 38th Infantry Division had been rendered combat ineffective before it fired a single shot at Henderson Field. Its surviving soldiers were on the beach at Cape Esperance. They could not do what they had been transported 700 miles from Rabaul to do. Yamamoto and the Imperial General Headquarters formally ordered the evacuation of Guadalcanal in December of 1942. The last Japanese soldiers were taken off Guadalcanal in the first days of February 1943. The man who should be at the center of this story is Rear Admiral Callaghan, and the specific nature of what he did on the night of November 12th is worth understanding precisely. He commanded 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers against a Japanese formation built around 2 of the most powerful battleships in the Pacific Ocean. Standard naval doctrine of the Second World War held that cruisers and destroyers do not engage battleships in direct surface combat, except when there is no tactical alternative. A battleship outguns a cruiser or destroyer at every surface combat range by a factor that makes the outcome predictable. Callaghan had no alternative that left Henderson Field standing. Callaghan had no alternative. If he turned away, the Japanese force reached Henderson Field. If he attacked, his ships would take severe damage and many of his men would die. He attacked. The attack produced such extreme confusion in the formation, with American and Japanese ships intermingled in the darkness at distances of hundreds of yards, that Abe could not safely complete the bombardment he had been sent to execute. Callaghan was dead on the bridge of the San Francisco before the battle he had started was over. He did not survive to know that his decision, which had cost him his life, had worked. Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe was formally relieved of command by Yamamoto within days of the battle's conclusion in mid-November. The formal charge against him was that he had turned his force north without completing the mission to bombard Henderson Field. Abe's argument to Yamamoto was that the situation after Callaghan's attack had made completing the bombardment mission tactically unsound and potentially catastrophic for the surviving ships of his formation. His formation was scattered and disorganized. The Hiei had taken significant topside damage. The location of surviving American ships in the darkness of Ironbottom Sound was unknown. The argument Abe made had genuine tactical merit. Yamamoto did not accept it and removed Abe from command. Abe's operational career in the Imperial Japanese Navy was effectively finished. The officer who had made the rational tactical decision not to continue a mission that had become untenable was held responsible for the loss of the entire Guadalcanal reinforcement operation. The officer who had died, making the tactically irrational but strategically necessary decision to attack with cruisers against battleships, received the Medal of Honor posthumously from a grateful government. The numbers at the end of November 15, 1942, are specific and worth stating precisely. Japan lost 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, 3 destroyers, and 7 of its 11 troop transports in 4 days of combined air and surface combat. The United States lost 2 light cruisers and 7 destroyers. In pure tonnage and ship count, the engagement numbers were closer than the strategic outcome suggested. But the numbers that decided Guadalcanal were not the ship counts on either side. They were the soldiers. Japan had sent 7,000 soldiers to Guadalcanal, and approximately 2,000 reached the island without their artillery and without the ammunition to fight with. The remaining 5,000 were dead or had never left the transports before they were sunk. Yamamoto had sent a division. He had delivered a remnant. The strategic consequence of the naval battle became clear within weeks. Japan could not replace what had been lost. The 2 battleships on the floor of Ironbottom Sound, the Hiei and the Kirishima, were not individually replaceable ships in the Japanese naval order of battle. Japan had fewer than a dozen operational modern battleships available for the entire Pacific War. Losing 2 of those in 4 days to a combination of cruiser fire, air attack, and radar-directed gunfire represented a permanent strategic reduction that the Japanese shipbuilding program could not compensate for. The American losses, as significant as they were in ship count and human cost, could be replaced within months. The warships under construction in American shipyards would begin entering the Pacific Fleet within months of the battle. Japan's losses at Guadalcanal would remain permanent losses. Hit subscribe right now, because coming up is why the 4-day battle of November 12 to 15 decided Guadalcanal in a way that no subsequent Japanese naval operation could reverse, what the radar aboard the USS Washington meant for the future of surface naval combat, and why the Americans who stopped the Japanese bombardment on the first night never lived to know they had stopped it. Do not go anywhere. Fleet Admiral Yamamoto's decision to withdraw from Guadalcanal, formally announced within the Japanese command in December of 1942, was the direct strategic consequence of what had happened in the 4 days of November. He had sent everything available for one decisive reinforcement operation, and that operation had failed at its first step. The transports that could carry reinforcements at scale were gone. The battleships that could bombard Henderson Field were gone. The aircraft losses over and around Guadalcanal had been significant enough that Japanese carrier aviation was no longer capable of contesting the waters around the island in any sustained way. The choice was between evacuating the survivors or watching them starve. Yamamoto chose to extract the survivors rather than continue feeding them into a campaign that could no longer be won. In early February of 1943, Japanese destroyers extracted approximately 12,000 survivors from Guadalcanal under cover of darkness. The island that Japan had held since the beginning of the war was in American hands. The 2 men who were most responsible for the American result on the first night did not survive to see the outcome they had produced. Callaghan was killed at the moment his battle reached its most chaotic point. Scott died within the same hour aboard the Atlanta. Neither man was present when the Washington fired at the Kirishima on the second night. Neither man knew that Henderson Field survived. Neither man knew that the transports were found and sunk in daylight on November 14th. The battle Callaghan had started by sailing 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers into a Japanese formation built around 2 battleships, ended 5 days after both men died, with Henderson Field intact, Guadalcanal secured, and Japan's ability to retake it permanently broken. Callaghan and Scott had bought, at the cost of their own lives, the time the Washington needed to do what it did on the second night. The Kirishima had a history before Guadalcanal. She had been launched in December of 1913 at Nagasaki, modernized as treaty limits evolved and then collapsed, and had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941 as part of the covering force for the carrier striking group that attacked the American fleet. She had been present at or adjacent to nearly every major Japanese naval operation in the first year of the Pacific War. She was scuttled in the hours before dawn on November 15, 1942, south of Savo Island, by a crew that had no means to save her and no option but to abandon her. The man who would later command her, Sanji Iwabuchi, survived the loss and took the shame of it to Manila 2 years afterward. The Washington's radar located the Kirishima in total darkness and put 9 armor-piercing shells into her before her crew could identify the threat. November 12th evening, Callaghan positions 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers to intercept Abe's bombardment force. November 12th to 13th, midnight. First naval battle of Guadalcanal. American and Japanese ships intermingled in Ironbottom Sound. Callaghan killed at 1:48 a.m. Scott killed. Abe turns north. Henderson Field not bombarded. November 13th. USS Hiei found and attacked by aircraft from Henderson Field. Scuttled afternoon. USS Juno torpedoed. Sinks in 20 seconds. 5 Sullivan brothers killed. November 14th day. American aircraft find Japanese transport convoy in daylight. 7 of 11 transports sunk. Thousands of Japanese soldiers killed in water. November 14th to 15th, midnight. Second naval battle. South Dakota loses power. Washington alone. Radar finds Kirishima at 8,400 yards. 75 16-inch shells in 7 minutes. 9 hits. Kirishima fatally damaged. November 15th, pre-dawn. Tanaka beaches 4 surviving transports at Cape Esperance. Attacked immediately by artillery and aircraft. November 15th. Kirishima scuttled. Japanese withdraw. Delivered. Approximately 2,000 soldiers. 260 cases of ammunition. 1,500 bags of rice of 7,000 who sailed from Rabaul. December 1942. Yamamoto orders evacuation of Guadalcanal. February 1943. Last Japanese soldiers evacuated. 6-month campaign ends. The 4 factors that explain the naval battle of Guadalcanal are Callaghan's attack on the first night, Abe's decision to turn back, Henderson Field's aircraft on November 14th, and the Washington's radar. The first factor was Callaghan's attack. The tactical situation on the night of November 12th gave Callaghan no good options. Turning away allowed the Japanese bombardment force to reach Henderson Field. Attacking with cruisers and destroyers against battleships produced predictable casualties. Callaghan attacked. The chaos his attack created in the Japanese formation, with American and Japanese ships firing at each other at ranges of hundreds of yards in total darkness, was the specific condition that caused Abe to abort the bombardment. Callaghan's death did not end the effect of his decision. The chaos he created outlasted him. The second factor was Abe's decision. Abe turned north without bombarding Henderson Field because the American attack had made the operational environment unclear. His lead ships were under fire from multiple directions simultaneously. The Hiei was taking damage. The positions of surviving American ships were unknown. He made the rational calculation that the cost of continuing outweighed the tactical value of the bombardment in the conditions that existed. He was correct in purely tactical terms. He was catastrophically wrong in strategic terms. Henderson Field, left intact by his decision to withdraw, directed the aircraft that located and sank 7 of the 11 transports on November 14th. Abe's tactical rationality was, in its consequences, Japan's strategic catastrophe at Guadalcanal. The third factor was Henderson Field itself, and the aircraft operating from it on November 14th. The airfield that was supposed to be destroyed on the first night became the weapon that destroyed the entire reinforcement operation the following day. The transport convoy that carried 7,000 soldiers was in open water in daylight on November 14th because the first night bombardment had failed. If the bombardment had succeeded, the transports would not have been in daylight. If the transports had not been in daylight, the Henderson aircraft could not have found and attacked them systematically. The field's survival on the first night was the enabling cause of Japan's operational failure at every subsequent stage. The fourth factor was the USS Washington's fire control radar and the crew that knew how to use it. The battle of November 14th to 15th was decided by radar capability in a way that no earlier Pacific surface engagement had been. The South Dakota had the same class of fire control radar and lost her electrical power at the critical moment. The Washington had radar and maintained full electrical power. In total darkness, at a range where unaided human vision cannot distinguish a ship from the sea around it, the Washington's Mark 8 system produced a firing solution accurate enough to put 9 of 75 16-inch shells on target. The Kirishima's crew could not identify the Washington before the Washington opened fire. The Washington's crew did not need to see the Kirishima to aim at it. Radar had permanently changed the conditions of night surface naval combat. The paradox at the center of the naval battle of Guadalcanal is not subtle, but it is worth stating precisely. Japan sent 2 battleships specifically to destroy Henderson Field, a convoy of 11 transports carrying 7,000 soldiers, and an entire supporting naval force in a single coordinated operation designed to end the Guadalcanal campaign in Japan's favor. The operation failed at the first step because a dead American admiral's attack on the first night caused the Japanese battleship commander to turn back without completing the bombardment. Henderson Field, which the battleships were supposed to destroy, directed the aircraft that destroyed 7 of the 11 transports the following day. The second Japanese battleship was then destroyed by the radar of a single American battleship fighting alone after its companion lost power. The 4-day battle that was meant to end the Guadalcanal campaign in Japan's favor ended it, permanently and definitively in the wrong direction for Japan, because the first step of a sequential plan failed, and because every subsequent step depended on that first step having succeeded. The Guadalcanal campaign was never a single battle or a single engagement. It was 6 months of fighting on land, at sea, and in the air, from August of 1942 to February of 1943. That November naval battle was the campaign's decisive and irreversible moment. Every operational decision made by both sides after November 15, 1942, was made with the understanding that the strategic balance had shifted permanently in American favor. Japan was no longer contesting the island in any meaningful operational sense. Japan was evacuating what remained of its forces from it. The Washington had fired at the Kirishima at 12:17 in the morning, November 15, 1942. By 12:24 in the morning of November 15th, the Kirishima was dying. By dawn on November 15, 1942, Japan had effectively and permanently lost Guadalcanal. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications, because every week we bring you the stories, the Pacific War histories, reduced to 2 paragraphs, without telling you that the 2 admirals who won the battle on the first night both died before dawn, that the 5 Sullivan brothers went down with the Juno in 20 seconds on the morning of November 13th, that the Japanese admiral who turned back without bombarding Henderson Field was held responsible for the entire campaign's loss, or that the Kirishima, the ship the Washington destroyed in 7 minutes, was the same ship whose survival of a previous sinking produced the man who would massacre 100,000 civilians in Manila 2 years later. Hit subscribe, then like, so this reaches the people who should know what happened in Ironbottom Sound in November of 1942. Drop a comment below telling us where you are watching from. We will see you in the next one. The USS Atlanta was a cruiser designed specifically for anti-aircraft defense. She carried 16 5-inch guns optimized for shooting down aircraft, not surface ships. When Callaghan positioned her in the formation on the night of November 12th, he placed her among the ships that would lead the encounter with the Japanese battleships. The Atlanta was struck by Japanese fire, and then by fire from the San Francisco, which had lost track of friendly ship positions in the close-range melee. Admiral Scott was killed. The Atlanta was eventually scuttled the following morning. She had been built to fight aircraft and was destroyed by surface ships on both sides in the same engagement. The confusion that killed her was the same confusion that stopped Abe from completing the bombardment. The 5 Sullivan brothers are a particular kind of American story. They enlisted together. They refused to be separated into different ships. The Navy granted the exception. They were assigned to the USS Juno together. When the Juno was struck by a Japanese Type 93 torpedo on the morning of November 13th and sank in 20 seconds, all 5 were aboard. Joseph, Francis, Albert, and Madison Sullivan died in the sinking. George Sullivan survived the ship but died in the water. The Navy rescue operations that might have reached him were delayed by concerns about Japanese submarines in the area. He died 5 days after the ship. The story of the Sullivan brothers drove Congress to pass the sole survivor policy, which protected the last remaining member of a family from combat deployment. The policy is still in effect. The Japanese soldiers who were aboard the 7 transports sunk on November 14th died in one of the most concentrated single-day losses of Japanese ground forces in the Pacific War. They were not sailors. They were ground troops who had been loaded onto transport ships at Rabaul and were being moved to Guadalcanal as reinforcements. They were not in combat positions. They were passengers. When the American aircraft found the convoy in daylight, the soldiers had no meaningful defense against air attack. They went into the water when their ships were sunk, and they died in the water, thousands of miles from the battle they had been sent to fight. Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka is one of the more consistent figures in the Guadalcanal naval campaign. He commanded the Tokyo Express destroyer runs that kept Japanese forces on Guadalcanal supplied through the long months of the campaign. He did this skillfully and persistently under conditions that other officers would have declared impossible. At the Battle of Tassafaronga on November 30th, 1942, his destroyers struck an American cruiser force that significantly outgunned them, sinking 1 cruiser and damaging 3 others, while losing only 1 destroyer. He was a highly effective combat officer, operating within a losing strategic situation that his tactical excellence could delay, but not reverse. He beached his surviving transports at Cape Esperance because the alternative was to turn back and deliver nothing at all. The Guadalcanal campaign is sometimes presented as a turning point equivalent to Midway. It was different from Midway in kind. Midway was a single engagement over 3 days in June of 1942 that destroyed 4 Japanese fleet carriers and the aircrew that had been trained to fly from them. Guadalcanal was 6 months of sustained attrition, fought simultaneously across land, sea and air, that progressively exhausted Japan's capacity to contest the South Pacific at the force levels the campaign required. Both were decisive. The mechanisms were different. At Midway, Japan lost the offensive capacity of its carrier force in 1 afternoon. At Guadalcanal, Japan lost the ability to sustain operations in the South Pacific over 6 months of grinding engagement. The naval battle of November 12 to 15 was the specific operational moment when the Guadalcanal campaign became strategically irreversible for Japan. Henderson Field itself was named in June of 1942 for Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine dive bomber pilot killed at the Battle of Midway on June 4th. Henderson had led his squadron in an attack against the Japanese carrier Hiei and was shot down. The airfield on Guadalcanal that bore his name became the central prize of the entire 6-month campaign. Every Japanese naval and ground operation from August through November of 1942 was in some sense an attempt to destroy the field that carried his name. The 2 battleships that were sent to bombard it in November failed to reach it. The aircraft operating from the field they were supposed to destroy found and sank the Japanese transports the following morning. Henderson Field outlasted every Japanese naval and air attempt to eliminate it between August and November of 1942. The American naval losses in November of 1942 were the worst of any single month in the Pacific War for surface combatants. 2 light cruisers and 7 destroyers sunk in 4 days, with additional ships badly damaged, represented a loss rate that alarmed the Navy's leadership. What prevented those losses from becoming strategically decisive in their own right was the ship replacement rate being achieved in American naval yards. By the end of 1942, American shipbuilding was producing warships faster than the Japanese could sink them. Japan had no equivalent production capacity. Every Japanese warship lost in the waters around Guadalcanal represented a permanent reduction in Japan's available naval combat strength. Every American warship lost could be replaced within months by a ship already under construction. The naval attrition of the Guadalcanal campaign was ultimately sustainable for one side and strategically catastrophic for the other. The Washington's performance in the second night engagement was studied by both navies after the battle. The specific element that drew the most analysis was the fire control radar. The Washington had achieved hit rates in total darkness at extended combat ranges against a maneuvering target that earlier Pacific surface engagements had not routinely produced, even in daylight conditions. The South Dakota had been in the same battle with the same general class of fire control equipment and had achieved nothing because her electrical systems failed. The lesson the Navy drew was not simply that radar was valuable, but that radar-dependent systems required redundant electrical infrastructure and crew training to maintain them under combat stress. The Washington had achieved what it achieved because her radar worked when it needed to. The South Dakota had failed to contribute because her electrical power failed at the moment the radar needed it.